Good morning. We continue the review summary of the conclusion of Ayin Beis, and we finished page 1462. We're at the top of 1463, which is really the last leg. The whole Hemshech concludes on page 1477. So we have basically 14 pages to go. And now we've learned all this once, the first time a few years ago. We're reviewing it because Rebbe Rashab did not conclude the Hemshech. So we decided to learn the source texts where this Hemshech, this part of the Hemshech of the Ayin Beis is based on. And we learned that inside for quite a while, on Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, Hamagbi L'Sheves, and from the Mittler Rebbe. And we learned them both. One was a 6-7 page Maimer, the other was a 75-page Maimer, a 74-page long Maimer. And that has helped inform us and understand the context, as well as understand the answers to some of the questions and the themes that the Rebbe Rashab never actually wrote down. I've also been sharing with you that I'm writing an essay on that. I've already written 5, probably be 7 parts. I've written 5 of those 7, shared them with everyone in the group. So now I'm mentioning it specifically because we're about to enter into that Maimer HaMakbil L'Sheves very directly. Let's first review what we learned yesterday, the previous class, and also general overview. What we learned yesterday was the conclusion of the discussion that the neshama comes down below. It's in a state of shcheirani, I am dark. Why? Because the neshama is concealed in the body and the animal soul. As each of us knows, you don't feel godliness. A neshama above, without the encumbrance of the body and the animal soul, does feel godliness. And that's what it's consumed with 24/7. It has no physical issues, no material issues, there's no body. So there's no health issues, there's no parnasa livelihood challenges, there's no therapy, there's no neurosis, there's no conflicts. Everything is like Gan Eden. Everything is beautiful. And yet, though it's darkened when it comes down below, v'nova, shcheirani v'nova, I am beautiful. Because the neshama retains its divine nature, and on the contrary, through its aveda below, it develops a tremendous appreciation, thirst, and longing for atzmus mamish on the deepest levels, deeper even than the experience of the neshamas above. That's the ultimate paradox. Now, he doesn't say it here, but you could add to the equation also because Hashem wants a dir b'tachtenim. Remember, the neshama is fulfilling the ultimate purpose only below. But here he's talking about the effect on the neshama, that ultimately this distance, this darkness, creates this tremendous, what he calls ava rabba and ava b'tainugim, a great love and a love of pleasures. And he explained it relatively at length. So it's the tzemoyin, the thirst, and the zrotzei, which brings to a level of riyah, to perceiving godliness. So it's not quite as it will be in the future when Mashiach comes, when all these encumberments that the body and animal soul will not be, it won't be dark anymore. But it's a me'ain. He calls it me'ain, a taste of it. And we discussed that at length yesterday's class, what that means. Yeah. And this is the meaning of the words b'midbar asher isa. In the midbar dafke, in the wilderness, where there's no revelation and there's no, so to speak, spiritual water, asher isa, that's where I see you, the riyah of the neshama. That's similar to the gili of la'asid, like I explained like we're eating on Erev Shabbos a taste of the food of Shabbos. The parentheses he explained, this Riyah has both an element of Ratzeh in it. Ratzeh means a yearning, a longing to reach something greater than yourself, beyond you. That's the Ratzeh, and everything wants to be absorbed in the source. Dveikus etzem be'etzem. And it also brings a shuv, because the thirst brings that need to quench the thirst. And how do you quench it? Through Torah and mitzvahs that saturates, in a sense, brings us ein mayim ela Torah. Torah is compared to water, mitzvahs as well, nurture and sustain us. And they maintain, and they have within them atzmus ein sof, because God placed himself within the Torah by Matan Torah. So you also have the level of shuv, a certain element of quenching the thirst. Obviously not quite as it will be again in the future, Lasud Lavi, but a taste of that. And that's what the Neshama says below. Shcheira Anivanova to the Neshamas above, B'nai Yerushalayim. I am dark but beautiful, that this concealment, dafka through that I reach this level of Avarab and Avabatanugim. And as we learn, that also elevates the Neshamas even above, because it teaches them also about levels of Atzmus that they are not aware of on their own. Umidbarcha Na'ava b'midbar ashari isa. Then the final piece we learned, this is the mashal of Er Hariyah. We spoke earlier that Er Hariyah is Malchus of Asiyah, because initially it's like a makabel, it needs an outside light to shine, to illuminate it. But then when it's illuminated, there's galus of the highest levels of Avarabba and Avatanugim of Atzmus and Neshama, higher than the Riyah of the Neshama above. This all happens dafka and Asiyah, dafka below, which brings out this deeper and more powerful and intense experience of Atzmus. That's what we summed up. Now, to put it into broader context, this whole section was a continuation of the Neshama's efforts down below to reach these levels. So we spoke about the last piece is the great thirst that happens from the distance and the darkness. But before that, we spoke about how the malachim, and before that, the Einei Ha'eda, are all like eyes, also like Riyah. They illuminate us, a siyua that supports us, and together with Torah and their mitzvah, all that allows us to find and experience godliness even in this dark world. But this last piece adds that the darkness itself propels us, because it's like a springboard that is like a catalyst that motivates and triggers this profound thirst, which is vital in this whole process. So it's interesting, Torah mitzvahs itself, and even Avav Yir, the Malachim, the Einei Ha'eda, they don't create the thirst. The thirst is created because of the darkness. But they help provide the support needed. Once you're thirsty, we're not all alone. So we have a Torah, we have mitzvahs, and we have the Malachim, and we have the Einei Ha'eda, the leaders, and the Malachim, all as our part support system to help us make it through the journey in life, the difficult and dark journey in this life. And ultimately leading us to the highest levels of revelation. And Lasud Lavi will be completely seen, where there'll be a seamless flow, that this world will be seen and experiencing godliness in this fullest sense of the word, Atzmus Mamish, in this world, after all the Aveda that we did over all the thousands of years that helped refine the world to be able to be a Keli and a channel to be able to see it. So now it's concealed more, and we have some taste of it through our Aveda, and Lasud Lavi will be completely revealed. That's the central theme of the last 110 pages. In the process, the Rebbe Rashab spoke about many things, of course, how Torah itself, if you remember, there's Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, all these levels in Torah. There's the level of Bria, Yitzir, Asiyah, that each of them also are part of the Torah support of helping us, guide us, because that's what the Torah is. Torah a Torah that illuminates and gives us direction. If we didn't have Torah, we didn't have the other support, would be impossible for us to discover light in a dark world. Just like eyes can't see in the dark. That's all part of what was discussed. But now we're ready to go back to what he began discussing on page 1352. From 1352, if you go back there, we began to discuss, to understand this whole process of how a neshama, through Ner Hashem Nishma Sodam, which have the three elements, as he discussed on page 1350. The three elements of a ner is a wick, which is the divine soul that's inserted in the oil, which is the intelligence of the animal soul. And initially, they're antithetical to each other because the neshama, the divine soul, is interested in godliness. The animal soul is interested in itself and its own self-preservation and self-interest. But with Shema Yisrael, these bonus of the neshama, like we learned, the neshama, the divine soul, impacts and tames and trains with the support of the malachim that we said in Birchas Yetzer before Shema. It tames the animal soul and turns the oil to be fuel for the flame, which is the third component in the candle, the wick, the oil, and the flame, which is the oir of oir ha'ava, the passionate fire, the passionate love of God. Ava kedish be'esh v'ahavtas Hashem lekecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, both yitzarecha, nefesh elikis, nefesh habamis. That's what he explained on page 1350 and 1351, which is a summary of the Hamagbi L'Sheves, the Maimer Mika Hashem Elokeinu Hamagbi L'Sheves of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe. Then he went on to say the same three things we find in a mitzvah, Ner mitzvah, because a mitzvah also has a Ner, candle. What's there? The mitzvah is manifest in Gashmi's Dika world, so that's the wick. The psila is the mitzvah because the Ratzon Elyon comes down into the physical object, that's the psila. With the oil, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it seems like the oil is the physical reality that the mitzvah is coming to transform. Let me just see. Yeah. And then when you perform the mitzvah, what's happening is you're elevating it to the level of Eir. Which Eir? The Eir of Teirah, the Eir Atzmi. And thus, as he puts it there, I'm looking at page 1352, that the Eir Teirah nechas ba'psila, the Teirah, it grasps and holds on to the wick, because the flame has to have somewhere to hold on to, which is the wick. That's the mitzvahs. All the Teirah Shabbat is Ikrin mitzvahs, and the mitzvahs are the ones that mechaber, they join and connect the Teirah with the person and the world, and thus refining both the animal soul and the world around us to become part of godliness. And then he concludes, Kamesha Kosav calls Ba'erech, all that's discussed at length in the Maimer of Teirah Mikashel Elokeinu Magbi. He actually quotes at the end of the paragraph on page 1352. And then he begins, V'nirali levayir ha'inyan, and appears to me, the best way to explain, the idea, he starts with Eir Hariyah, to explain what is vision and what is sight. And in that context, he brings also the moonlight and the light and the luminous stone. And all that has now been concluded. So now he's going to go back. You see the top line on page 1463, where we're up to now, and we'll continue now. And you can follow the pages if you want to follow the text and you don't have the book, the Sefer, at ayinbeis.com. So it says, Ma'atet tzarech lahavin, Mashakasav, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodam, V'ksiv Kiner Mitzvah. So he's taking us back to literally to page 1350 and on. So this is just the flow that these 110 pages, 112 pages to be exact, if you count from 1350, which began the whole discussion of the yichud, the joining, and the interface of the divine existence B'mayla Mata through Teirah Eir, That's how it begins, page 1350. All that is now coming to conclusion here. And he's bringing us back to the psukim that he'd explained then, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, as well as Ner Mitzvah, where there's two levels of Ner, the Ner of the Neshama, the Ner of the Mitzvah. Like he says, Ki Ner Mitzvah, Shaneshama Nikra Ner, V'chen HaMitzvah Nikra Ner, HaMitzvah's Nikra Ner, or Nikrois Ner. So now we're continuing back, and now you see the connection and the flow. Because we learned the Maimorim in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, it's a lot more clear, the whole picture, because we understand the context, as well as as we'll learn many answers to questions and explanations that the Rebbe Rashab is not going to fully spell out. So that we'll see now in the next 14 pages till the conclusion of Ayin Beis. But that's the connection through it all. So this is bringing us back literally 112 pages back to where he started talking about Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom and Ner Mitzvah Teira Er. So again, and now, after all this that we've learned, we'll understand. We need to understand what it means Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom v'nizboyer and Ner Mitzvah v'nizboyer, and it was explained. We're talking now back again on page 1350 and on. The Ner Keil Shemen Upsila Va'ir, that the Ner is comprised of Shemen, oil, a wick, and the light it creates. The Gimel Yonim Elu Yeshlam B'Ner de Neshama or B'Ner de Mitzvahs. These three elements exist both in the flame or the candle of the Neshama, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, it's a Ner, and in the Ner of Mitzvahs, Ner Mitzvah. As soon as you call it Ner, you're saying it has three elements in it: the wick, the oil, and the light it produces. So briefly, you already explained these three earlier. So why does he say here we have to understand it? Because now, remember, the whole thing began with Nidali Levayir. We'll understand it through understanding Er Hariyah. Now that we understand the dynamics of a neshama coming down below and getting concealed shcherani in a darkened state, and how it starts the journey of illuminating its life with godliness, which will include through Ner Mitzvah and Teira Er, through Teira and Mitzvahs. Now we can understand what these psukim mean and their relationship with each other. So what's really happening here is the Rebbe Rashab is, as I put it in my essay, and I said it in a number of these classes, think of it as a triad. We're talking here a triad of three elements here: the neshama, mitzvahs, and Torah, and how they all come together. And when they come together, that's what transforms this world into a dira b'tachtenim. So the neshama has tremendous power, but it's concealed. And mitzvahs and Torah have it more revealed, but they're not as manifest in the physical world quite like the neshama is. And you need both, because Hashem wants a dira b'tachtenim, and He wants this world, dafka the darkness. Even though a mitzvah does manifest in physical items, as he mentioned, and we'll discuss more at length as we go along, but it's still not like a neshama in a body. You don't say the physical items conceal the light of the mitzvah or the flame of the candle of the mitzvah. It does manifest in it. Like for example, tefillin in parchment, it's made of the hide of an animal, or tzitzis from tzemer of wool of a sheep. And the same thing with all mitzvahs that are physical mitzvahs. So it does enter into the physical world, but it's not quite like a neshama which comes down and becomes part and parcel of this world, where the neshama is completely one with the body and the animal soul, and indeed is darkened by it. So we'll learn as we go along. The Rebbe Rashab does not ever finish this triangle of neshama, Torah, and mitzvahs. He stops, as we'll see, he stops in the middle of where the neshama is affecting the animal soul through these bonus of Shema, and it transforms it to V'ahavtas Hashem l'kecha b'chol avavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, but he never gets back to mitzvah, Ner Mitzvah and Teira Er. And that is where we go back to the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, and we can see what the continuation would have been, which is exactly what we're doing now, learning it with that in that context. So right now But he began. So by him saying Ma'atet Tzarich Lahavim Mashakosov, it's very clear that that's what he wants to do. But he never gets back to the three elements in the mitzvah, and he definitely doesn't get back to Torah Er. So we were able to extrapolate what would be the conclusion based on what he does say here, and based on the Mamorim that this is based on. The source Mamorim, namely Hamagbiel Shevis, and some of the other Mamorim, but namely that one. So that's what we're doing now, that we're much more informed than we did when we learned it the first time. So we said basically that you have all three elements, both B'ner Nishama or B'ner the mitzvahs. The Nizboyer. So again, he's summing up and elaborating on what we learned back then, but now it's with a more elaboration. So the next few pages is going to be dedicated to understanding the dynamics. Based on everything we've learned about Neshama coming down below, we'll understand the profundity and the deeper meaning of Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. What is the idea? That the soul of a human being down below is a Ner Hashem, is a flame of God. So that's what he's going to explain now. Again, briefly, he said it already back on page 1350 and 1351. But now he's elaborating. So before I continue, let me stop if anybody wants clarification, because my main emphasis in this class has been so far to understand the flow and the connections, the juncture, so to speak, how this flows from what we learned earlier. This is a critical piece of understanding the bigger picture. Does anyone want to ask anything? Okay. So the third line on page 1463, V'nizboyer. So he already said twice Nizboyer, because he's summing up what we learned. And it was explained back and again, 1350 and 51. The B'ner the Neshama, when he talk, first he starts with Neshama. He's going to go back to mitzvahs on page 1466, but he's not going to answer the question. He's just going to say, now let's understand the three things in the mitzvah. And that's one of the signs that we know that he didn't finish the Hemshah, because he never gets back to it. But right now he's talking about Ner Neshama. So the Ner Neshama, what are the three things? Hapsilahi Neshama. The wick is the divine soul. That it comes down into a state of like a wick, because the Neshama does come down, and it is what will carry the flame towards the Neshama. The Kamei b'moshel haner, and now going back to the moshel, like it is an example of the candle, hapsila she'eves es hashemen. What is the psila's role or function? How does it work? The psila draws the oil. As we've discussed and we've learned, if there was only a wick, it would burn out very quickly. So the psila is material that can be inserted in the oil, and as such, it's able to draw the oil in a very paste fashion that the candle will be able to burn. And what's the process? Once you light it, the oil slowly is absorbed into the wick. Shenichla and nichla and venisraf, it gets consumed and basically burned up in the light, in the flame that is being produced by the wick and the oil. By dezer oir oir bohir. And through this, the oir is a clear and steady light. It doesn't say the word steady, but in Torah, the Alter Rebbe's Maimon, he does say that. Meaning, if it was only the wick, or if the oil was very polluted, you would not have a clear flame. When you see a flame burning properly, the way it's supposed to burn, if you look closely, you have a very pure wick and you have very pure oil. And the oil is slowly being absorbed into the wick, and it creates a oir bahir.
Why can the light get directly from the oil?
Try it out. It doesn't work, because you need to have, you're talking Aveda or Begashmias?
Begashmias.
That's the way God created it. What should I tell you? You can, in the Maimorim there, he speaks about oil without a wick. He says it won't burn. I mean, you could light oil, by the way, but it's not going to turn into a ner. It'll be like, I don't know if you ever saw it. Like sometimes you take alcohol and you can make a flame, it'll last for a few seconds on the surface, but it will not be kind the mitzvah of Ner Shabbos or Ner Chanukah. It's not a Ner, nor Ner HaManera in the Beis HaMikdash. A Ner requires a psila. Without a psila, you don't have a flame. And you definitely don't have a flame that is illuminating. That's begashmis. Beruchnis, the reason is because the oil of the animal soul needs the divine soul to channel it. But begashmis as well. The wick channels. The wick on its own is not fuel. It's an entity that's conducive to absorbing the fuel of the oil. So in Aveda, if you only had a nefesh habamis, God forbid, you wouldn't have anything to train and harness the animal soul to v'haftas Hashem elakacha b'shnei b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. And here the wick plays that role, but he's still talking the mashal. So he says, Kamoy Kain, that's the mashal. How is it the nimshal? Kamoy Kain hu shashem and hu nefesh habamis. Same thing in the nimshal, in the moral. The oil is the animal soul. V'apsila shia neshama melubeshes beguf, and the psila, which is the neshama, the divine soul, that manifests in the body. Sheyeves es hanefesh habamis. So just like the wick draws the oil, the neshama sheyeves draws the nefesh habamis. Liesnichla ba'ira leki the neshama. That's the role. That's the avodah. The divine soul is educating and harnessing and taming and converting that animal soul, what's on its own, would be interested in its own interests, that it should become and drawn into the psila, should be nichla, like he said, nichla v'nisref, nichla ba'era l'ki the neshama. To be encompassed in the divine flame of the neshama. Simply put, that the nefesh habamis is not doing what it wants, is doing what the neshama wants. So oil itself can be used for many different things. Here, the neshama the psila is causing the oil to be directed and drawn into the Eira Leki of the neshama, and soon we'll learn that's the V'haftas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. V'ayidei zeh, and here's a key line that especially now we can understand it well, based on what we learned. Nasi yisun er b'neshama. This causes an additional yisun er, additional advantage, additional quality of oil in the neshama. So it's not just for the nefesh habamis, because up to here you could say, you know what, the nefesh halikis is intact, and all it's doing is turning the animal soul into a divine force. But the answer is no. We learned before shcheirani, the neshama coming down into the body and the animal soul down below actually causes it to develop a much deeper level of ava, rabba, and ava b'tainugim. So the nefesh habamis actually propels the nefesh halikis to heights it cannot reach on its own, even higher than the neshama above, as we learned at length. And he said that explicitly. If you go back to page 1455, he said that explicitly. That is dafka, the resistance and the concealment of the animal soul that propels the divine soul to higher levels. But that was essentially the theme of Shcheira Nivanova. So that's the additional, and that's why you see, that's what he says in Torah the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and the Mittler Rebbe, that the psila on its own would not burn with such intensity. It would burn very quickly and burn out. The paradox is, and the irony, that the fuel from the animal soul causes the nefesh halikis to burn with much longer and much more beautiful and much more smooth, like he said. But that's only once the neshama harnesses the animal soul. We understand there's a battle going on. And we don't even need, in Tanya he explains the battle at length, but just look in our lives. So he's talking here the best case scenario where the nefesh halikis has managed to get the nefesh habamis to follow and be drawn, its fuel should be drawn into the wick of the divine soul. But before that, there's a battle going on. But at the end of the day, it's the oil that actually causes the flame to burn for the amount of time and in a smooth and beautiful way. That would not happen. I think he even says in the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe that it would flicker if the psila was burning on, and didn't have any oil, it would not only burn out quickly, it would not even be a flame that you could talk about. Besides quickly burning out, it would also flicker and not be that smooth flame like you see when a proper flame is burning, a real nair. No, but you can't even call it a nair to that extent. A psila that is lit would not be called a candle. It'd be called a lit piece of cloth or a lit piece of cotton or whatever the wick is made of. Yishun er ba neshama. Okay. So that's a summation of what we learned back on page 1350 and 1351. It's a few more aces, a little more explanation, but that's briefly the summation of the Ner. He doesn't talk a lot about what kind of it is. Is it the Torah and so on? He just says it's the Leki. In the Maimorim of the Mittler Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, the is the of Ava, of Ahaftas Hashem Lekecha, b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, which is love. Love is a form of a fire, even a passionate love, Ava Karish Eish, as they put it in those Maimorim. But that's all part of the longer explanation of this whole topic. But that's what he concludes right now. Before I continue, he's going to say by Inyan, he's going to explain this now, but I will stop if anybody wants to ask anything.
I joined late, but I've been listening for the past 10 minutes. And my question is on the very last thing you translated, or that you gave over, that you explained. This advantage of the light. I understand you explained that like the light of the soul, which is the psila, would flicker and burn out. It wouldn't be like a continuous light like you see in a candle, and that's because of the shemen, which is the nefesh Bahamas. So my question is more practical. Is he saying here that essentially, if but not for the nefesh Bahamas, the soul, if it were, I don't know, really had. I don't know if he must be referring to the soul in the body. And I'm translating this into the human form. Wouldn't be stable. It would be like you might think someone's a nutcase, like talking about God all the time, or maybe they're literally mentally unstable. Is he saying here that the body or the nefesh Bahamas really the sikhlis of the natural intellect? There's something about the natural animalistic instincts and intellect, mind, cognition of a human being that somehow stabilizes the way the soul sits, if you will, in the body. Can you go that far? I mean, you didn't say that, but that's the implication of what you said.
You can go that far and even further, but I wouldn't use the word crazy, because it could take on different forms. I mean, just imagine a person their soul is very active and alive, but they're not engaging with the animal soul and the body. What would happen? You couldn't survive in this world.
Right.
We have to eat, we have to drink, we have to do business. So basically, it's like what the Baal Shem Tov says on the pasuk Ozev Tazev Imei, Kisira Chamer Senacha. If you see the body and the animal soul as your enemy, and you're constantly punishing it or afflicting it or fasting, you're not going to have what we'll call a stable life. The key and being practical is very simple. You have to engage this physical world and your physical body, which includes your animal soul, to live a normal life. If you're going to live, Ben Azai lived nafshi choshka b'teira. He lived a life. He was single. He never got married, and it wasn't a positive thing. So the very much part of a soul in this world, not in Gan Eden, in this world, is not just that it manifests in a body, animal, soul, but engages with it. So bottom line, if you're like living with the enemy, so to speak, and you don't in any way tame and harness it, it's not going to allow you to really do your life, to work, to live your life properly. So essentially, this is the process of a psila, the wick of the divine soul, engaging with the oil of the animal soul, and turning it to fuel. So let's say you eat a meal, and you eat it l'shem shamayim. That's a perfect example. So you're taking the body and the animal soul's experience.
Physicality, yeah.
And turning it into L'Shem Shemayim, understanding, making a blessing, eating kosher, elevating the food and the sparks within it. So that's the Nefesh Halikis, is using the body and the animal soul as fuel for Alikus. And the same thing when a person does a mitzvah. I'm not talking about the Ner mitzvah part. You take a physical object and you use it and direct it towards Hashem. So essentially, that's what that's like a wick, directing the animal soul's oil, so to speak, fuel, toward not fueling the animal soul's interest, fueling the divine soul's interest, which is God's interest.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
What makes the light to burn? The wick or the oil?
What lights the flame?
Yes.
Look at Begashmius. You need the person to light the flame. They don't light themselves. You can have a wick, and you could have an oil. Now you need someone to light it. So my answer would be when the neshama says Shema Yisrael, or for that matter does a mitzvah, or learns Torah. So the neshama has ignited itself through Torah and mitzvahs, or through tefillah for that matter, Shema, and that in turn starts acting on the oil. If a person wakes up in the morning and Chaz v'Shalom doesn't daven, and doesn't learn, and doesn't do mitzvahs, and just goes to eat and drink and to business, you're not going to have a Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. You're not going to have a lit Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, I should say. You're going to have maybe a pilot flame within his etzem, but it's not activated. So it'd be like an unlit candle. So when we go, and it says, like the Rebbe Rashab said, that the Talmidim of Tem Chazmim are Neiris Lahoyer, that they are candles that illuminate. When Adon HaKohen goes and lights the menorah, then it's lit. Without that, you have a menorah, you have wicks, you have oil, but you don't have a lit menorah. When you go and meet a Jew, let's say, in business, or someone, or a friend, or a stranger, and you don't say anything to him about Yiddishkeit, so you've not done anything to light any candle. So yes, his neshama has a potential flame in it, and maybe even a pilot flame, but it's all like Ava Mesoteres. It's concealed. When you talk to him about Torah, or a mitzvah, or a kind act, or you do some tzedakah, what you're doing is the person is now taking the flame, is lighting the flame, and therefore transforming the oil into, and by drawing it into the wick of the Nefesh Halikis, into Oir Eliki.
Begashmias, what makes the light, the psilo or the oil?
What do you mean, what makes the light? What lights the light, or what burns? Both of them are burning together. Take away the psila, you won't have a candle. Take away the oil, you won't have a flame. It's a partnership. It's joining together.
Yeah, but the fact is that if you have a psila, there is fire.
Listen, why don't you take an experiment in your own kitchen and light a flame? You tell me which is light. You need both. You don't have a wick, it's not going to burn. You don't have a fuel, it's also not going to burn.
It will burn, but it's one hold. Is the oil only
It'll burn for a split second, and it won't be, we can't call it a nair. A candle is a candle. It's a burning candle. It has to burn for a certain period of time.
So my question is, what is the oil doing? Is the oil just holding up the wick, should not be burned, or it's also giving the part of the light? I think it's giving the part of the light, because it's
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Are you talking about the flame?
The flame is what makes the flame, the psilo or also the oil? Because the psilo,
maybe someone else could take over, because I'm not sure what else I could say.
I said the psilo holds the fire, correct? But it cannot hold a long time. So what is the oil doing? The oil is only making the psilo not to burn.
The oil is called fuel. It's like gas in your car. You can have a car, and the gas runs out. The car's not going to move. Well, I'm not sure what's missing here. A psila is not fuel. A psila is like a channel that channels the fuel. It has a drop of something, that's why it'll burn for a second, but it's not going to burn for any long time. The fuel channels through the shayevis as a shemen.
I have a question that may help Rabbi Teitzel understand this better. I don't know if you said this before, like when we went through this before or not. As everybody knows, there's this notion of the Pintel Yid, which is it's neshama inside the goof.
I just said that the pilot flame. I called it.
Okay, that's what I mean. That was my question. Okay, but that being said, I knew that's what you were referring to. That's not my question. My question is there are Jews, firm Jews, maybe Hasidim, maybe not. Probably that would use the saying Pintel Yid to, let's say, a secular Jew. I remember when I was a very young. I was young in my early 20s before I did Chazar B'Tshuva, and I was in a hospital. I was like a candy striper. And I was trying to help a very, very frum family. Their child was sick in Stanford Children's Hospital. I don't know, I must have said something very self-deprecating about myself, like, maybe I was trying to get them kosher food. I don't know. And I said I was something very negative about my Yiddishkeit, and like I can't compare to them in terms of my Jewish identity, Jewishness. And the woman said to me in broken English, or even in Hebrew, I don't remember. She says, "You know what? You're a Jew. You're a Pintel Yid. You can't. Nothing can take that away from you. So don't tell me you're not Jewish. Whatever." The point is, she was speaking. She's not a scholar of Chassidus. She just hasn't learned this mimer. And I'm saying she's not the only person that would have said that to me. The notion of Pintel Yid. My question is it derived from this sugya, or the notion of Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam? Is that why that notion of Pintel Yid in Yiddishkeit comes from this pasuk, or it just happens to be the case? Coincidence.
There are many psukim. I mean, if you remember a few minutes ago, I used the word Ava Mesuteres from Tanya. Tanya doesn't use the word Pintel Yid. Sometimes in Hebrew, Nekudas Hayadus is Pintel Yid. So Pintel Yid is an expression in Yiddish. You're not going to find it in a verse, but it's based on many things. First of all, every human being is created in the divine image. Then the Alter Rebbe's chapter 2 in Tanya, Chelik Elakam Mal Mamish, and Vayipach Ba'apav Nishmas Chayim, Metechi Yusei, Mepnimi Yusei, and that everyone's like a ben, which comes from Etzem Moyecha'av. I can go now a list of maybe 50 verses and Mamar Chazal that all build that are the basis of this concept. So it's a fundamental basis in Torah that Hashem infused the human being with a neshama, and that neshama is a divine nature. And then they talk about the levels. In Tanya, he ultimately calls it Ava Mesuteres, that comes from Chachma Shebenefesh, which has within it Ein Sof. I mean, if you want the real so-called actual level, but I can go out. But that's a topic that's outside of the scope of what that's fundamental piece beyond Ayin Beis, not a chiddush from Ayin Beis. Ayin Beis here he's talking about it in the context not about that at all, not addressing here etzem nekudas hayadus or etzem aneshama or so on. Here he wants to speak about how the divine soul interacts with the animal soul. That's the discussion here. I just said it because I wanted to give the picture, so I'm explaining it because you want to dissect it into detail. But ultimately, because it'll confuse matters. Once you start saying that the Nekudas Hayadus, maybe that itself is a flame. But the Rebbe Rashab is breaking it down based on the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, that there are three things. There's the wick, there's the oil, and then there's the flame. So in Avodas Hashem, like in the Avodah, when a Neshama is contemplating on Shema, and Ma'arich Be'echad, what it's doing, if you want to visualize it, it's the wick drawing the oil, meaning the intelligence of the animal soul. It's engaging it and turning it into fuel to lead to the flame of Ava Karish Be'esh, the fiery flame of V'ahavtas Hashem Lakecha B'chol Avavcha B'shnei Yitzarecha. That is the essential point here. Does it touch upon many things about what a neshama is, and Pintel Yid, or Etzem Nekudas Hayad, or Etzem? There's not mentioning here Yechida He didn't talk about the nefesh ruach neshama chay yechida or that. He did talk about it earlier, but right here, that's the context. And as you know, I always like to focus on what we're learning here. Does it touch upon all of that? To some extent. But I don't think it's even necessary to go into it, but I don't see how it's going to add to the understanding of what we're learning here. But is it in the bigger picture? Yes, it's all correct.
Okay, thank you. That was extremely helpful. Thank you for taking the question.
Okay, so now the next section is, again, based on the Maimorim that I mentioned, namely Mika Hashem Elokeinu Magbia L'Sheves of the Alter Rebbe and Mittler Rebbe, including a Hagah from the Tzemach Tzedek that he's going to add a little later. And he's going to, in the next 1, 2, 3 pages and a few, maybe 3.5 pages, he's going to explain Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam in more detail of how that works exactly. And even some of the things we talked about now may be more understandable and more and maybe answered as well as we go along here. So I will wait till we finish this whole piece. I think you'll understand it a lot better, because he's going to spell out exactly how this works, how the dynamics of the neshama, or I should say the wick of the neshama, and the oil of the animal soul, and the fire or the light that it creates, how that works in specific detail. So the next section now, which I'm probably going to stop here because he's going to start talking about what is the shemen. He wants to talk about the shemen in more detail, which was not discussed earlier. I mean, I explained it more, and we learned that the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, that shemen is chochmah, and that ultimately he's going to talk about the shemen of the nefesh habamis, but there's different levels of oil. Remember, there's the shemen in the Beis Hamikdash is not shemen of the nefesh habamis. So we're going to learn different types of shemen, and then get back to how to understand the oil in the context of Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the oil of the animal soul. I'll also mention that you may find when you learn other places in Chassidus, the concept of Ner being the wick, the oil, and the flame is explained in different Maimorim in different ways. Even the Alter Rebbe in Torah, if you look at the Maimer before Mika Hashem Elokeinu, and I think the Maimer afterwards as well, he explains it differently. So you may find different explanations of how these three things work. Sometimes, for example, the wick is the animal soul, and the flame is the divine soul. I explain it that way actually in Torah Meaning for Life, my first chapter, and no one pointed that out. Maybe you don't remember, but in the first chapter I talk about the neshama being a transcendent flame that is always seeking something greater, and the wick is like the body and animal soul that grounds it. Because in some places that's how it's explained, but it's not a contradiction, because this is a pasuk that can be explained in many ways. And Chassidus chooses different ways to explain sometimes the same verse or the same idea. Here it's very clear. The psila is the nefesh elokis, the wick is the wick, the flame is the shemen is the nefesh, the seichel of the nefesh habamis, chochmah, as we're going to learn. And then there's the flame that it creates, the divine flame, which is also what that means exactly. And if you read my essay, I already touched upon it as well, because remember, Ner Mitzvah also creates a flame. And the question is it the flame of Torah or is it the flame of the mitzvah? So we'll talk about that as well. Does the neshama create a flame without Torah mitzvahs? Or is it the flame of Torah mitzvahs that it creates? That I don't want to go into right now, because that's a deeper discussion. There's a note from the Tzemach Tzedek on that can help us understand it better. But I'm just pointing out there's a lot of aspects of this discussion.
Was that part 4 of your essay? Do you remember which part?
I think it's maybe even part 2 or 3. I talk about it. It's not the whole essay, not that whole part. In it, I talk about
discussed it. Yeah,
I address it very directly, that there are 2 ways you can understand it. He explains 2 different ways to understand it. Mm-hmm. Maybe I have to look it up, but maybe part 3 or part 2 even.
Okay.
Well, my next part, I'm summing up all the parts. Yeah, I think it's part 3. One of the parts I talk about that very directly. And I talk about it more than once because it's relevant in the bigger picture. But there it's more, it's also about the issue what the neshama creates through Shema, even if it doesn't have yet mitzvahs and Torah. Because clearly, he says there that the neshama mitzad atzma does create a love that even the animal soul is part of. And that doesn't sound like that it's a mitzvah or a Torah, even though you could say saying Shema is a mitzvah in that sense, but the tefillah part, this is something I want to discuss, but I'll discuss it later when in the right context. So I'm going to stop here because the next section is going to start talking about what is Shemen. Shemen is Chachma and different levels of Chachma till he gets back to Shemen being the Chachma, the wisdom, or the intelligence, I should say, of the animal soul. So we'll stop here by the end of the sentence. 7 lines. Yeah, 7 lines, I believe, from the top of page 1463. Are there any other questions before I stop the recording? Okay.
Would we say that the bottom line is everything is for the neshama to come down here, that this is the tachlis hakavona? Because without the neshama, the Torah mitzvahs will not do anything for that purpose.
Of course. Torah mitzvahs would be completely stationary. They'd just be there. What's a Torah mitzvah without a human being acting on it? Even now, if you have Torah and a mitzvah, Torah and mitzvahs, and a human being doesn't do anything, the Torah sits in the Aron Kodesh or in a Sefer. The mitzvahs are there in concept, but you always need the Adam, the person, the Gavra, that activates Torah and mitzvahs. So no question, the Neshama is the central piece in it all.
I mean, just